Well, hi guys. Let's talk about Beethoven, huh? Um, if you want to be safe, well, okay, the years for Beethoven 1770 to 1827. He is definitely in that transition from classical to romantic. So when someone says, "What period does Beethoven belong in?" A lot of people will say, "Oh, he's a classical composer, classical period composer." I would argue with that. Okay, if you want to be safe, you could say he's transitional for sure. But you guys, Beethoven, I will propose to you, almost single-handedly brings in the romantic period in music all by himself. Every time they talk to a romantic composer, who they worship, it's Beethoven. So let me just say that Beethoven really starts the romantic period. Okay, now you can pick up a book, and it'll say the classical period goes till 1827. Oh, that's interesting. Same year as Beethoven dies. Yeah, so they're using him as a symbol of the end of the classical period. Thing is, Beethoven. Now, of course, he started in the classical period, guys, and you always start where you are, okay. But he quickly showed that he wasn't content to stay with traditional classical conservatism. Also, he had an intense desire to express more emotions. Classical period, since the Renaissance, is the first period in history of music where we would actually say they stepped back a little bit from this expressing their emotions. They didn't get rid of the emotions, but they became a little more distant, a little more detached, if you will. And this is because most music is being written for the aristocrats and nobility who are still ruling Europe, even though we've had the French Revolution. But that's not until 1789. And the thing is, it takes a while for that to be felt. Okay. So what you really can consider the Romantic period are the echoes or the reverberations of the French Revolution. So there are lots of things that Beethoven shares with the Romantic period and brought them in almost by himself in most cases, or many cases anyway. But there are two that really stand out. Individualism, that each composer could and should sound different from any other composer, which is interesting because when you look at the classical period, Haydn and Mozart, even music majors have trouble telling them apart sometimes. But that's because we could argue that form tops content in many ways. Well, okay. Beethoven was not happy with that. What's the second one? We had individualism and emotionalism. He's trying to find, we're back on track to finding more ways to express ourselves emotionally. So those two things just stand out with Beethoven early on. And so he's just, of course, it takes a while to get there because he's exploring on his own, more or less. Why is Beethoven so different? Also, he considers himself a child of the Revolution. The Romantic period is so much about the French Revolution in so many ways. Um, and so he has a very different view than Mozart, who is only 17 years younger than or older than he was. But Mozart never talks about revolution or anything in his letters. It's just all about whether they liked him in Prague. But in Beethoven, his letters are full of discussions about the revolution and their effects and what it means for the future and things like this. So he considered himself a child of revolution. That is a fact. Okay. And so this is a huge part of what informs us about Beethoven's view of how things should be. Now, why was the French Revolution so important? Well, because when it happened, France was the most populous state in Europe, the most wealthy state in Europe, the most powerful military in Europe, was the biggest proponent of Enlightenment philosophy, Enlightenment ideas, and was just basically the leader in Europe intellectually and philosophically. It was a country that looked like it was working. So when the French Revolution occurs, people went, "Whoa! If it could happen in France, man, it could happen anywhere." And that's exactly what they thought. They thought it'd be another one of these domino effect things, and that there would be revolutions all across Europe, and everybody was going to throw off the aristocracy and move into democracy. Um, that didn't happen. There were revolutions, okay, but you can argue the only really successful one was the French Revolution, okay. But there certainly were a number of revolutions where they were trying to do this. So the sentiment was there; it just didn't succeed, okay. Um, okay, let's talk about Beethoven and more specifically about music. I would tell you that Beethoven was an innovator without equal. And in fact, many times he left his audiences kind of shocked because they couldn't understand where he was coming from. Okay. Now, let's talk about some characteristics of the classical period. The classical period, remember, we said symmetry, balance, proportion. These are some of the aesthetics that rise to the top in the classical period. With the romantic period, we're talking about something completely different. And these are characteristics we find in Beethoven's music, okay? So instead of balance and symmetry and even phrases, we wind up with uneven prose like phrases. So we have lopsided phrases connecting unbalanced structures. So now we're back to, sort of, in a way, back to the lopsided pearl thing. It's just whatever you do. They would start with a certain structure, classical forms. Yes, they would. And Beethoven was the only one. But then that's a starting point. You would change it to express what it is you need to express. Okay, but just because you start with that doesn't mean that's where you stay. Okay, um, we have all kinds of tricks that Beethoven. Discontinuous rhythms, rhythm and pitch are separated and treated separately for development, which is a huge part of the emotional aspect of it, and all to achieve this emotional response. Okay, so those are many of the aesthetics that Beethoven wished for and craved, and they're the ones that get celebrated in the Romantic period. Beethoven was born in Bonn, Germany, 1770. Bonn, for those of you, well, probably most of you are too young to remember this, was the capital of West Germany when East and West Germany were still divided by the Iron Curtain. And so when the curtain came down, they moved the capital back to its traditional location, which was Berlin. But up until that point, Bonn was traditional location for Germany as it was as a unified country. Well, all right. At this point in time, Germany's not actually a unified country yet. Okay, but at least to give you an idea of the influence that Bonn has. Okay, and why it does eventually become the capital of West Germany at that point. Beethoven, born in Bonn, and then in 1792, he decides to go to Vienna. He moves away from home and he goes to Vienna where all the cool composers are hanging out, right? Okay, in 1796, he develops ringing in his ears. By 1818, he was totally deaf. Okay. Um, and he didn't live all that long. He was in his 50s. And so he probably died of, I mean, you could say drinking too much, but it's the other things that get you when your whole system is run down, with whether it's cirrhosis or whatever. Probably pneumonia. That's probably what got him. But he was a big alcoholic. Okay. Um, and when he died, guys, this is something else that marks the difference between the Romantic and Classical period. When Beethoven died, 10,000 people lined the streets to see his funeral procession like he was royalty, aristocracy, or something. This is new. This is not something that has really happened before to a commoner. Okay. This would have been like a royal funeral or something. Um, and so, yeah. Now, traditionally, uh, biographers like to follow his life through his symphonies. Now, he only wrote nine, okay, which is in big contrast to Mozart, 41 symphonies, or Haydn, 104. Whew. Well, okay. So was he lazy? Well, no. A couple of things. One, he worked slower, but he was also meticulous. He was known to write an entire page, be disgusted with it, scratch it all out, wad it up, throw it away, and start all over again. So it took him a long time to process something. Also, though, his works are longer. And by the time we get to the Ninth Symphony, depending on who's conducting, we're talking maybe as long as an hour and a half. as opposed to a traditional classical symphony, which is 20 minutes, 25 tops, maybe. So, yeah, things are getting longer because he felt they had a lot more to say, and the Romantics felt they had a lot more to say, okay? By the time we get to the end of the Romantic period, we've got symphonies that are 2 hours or more long. The traditional way to divide up his nine symphonies were the first phase would be called Juvenalia, which are all his works before he left Bonn for Vienna. No symphonies here, okay? Then his second period, which is traditionally labeled the Viennese period, where he supposedly absorbs the classical style. He writes symphonies one and two, and you guys, even though he's writing in pretty much, let's say, fairly strict classical style, he's changing things that Haydn established as the standard for the classical period. Things like switching out the minuet for a scherzo, starting with Symphony Number Two, and he does some other things. I'll tell you, I'll run down a list of things of how he changes everything, even from the very beginning, and why he's such a revolutionary. But anyway, so the second period is Viennese period, 1792 to 1802, approximately, which includes his first two symphonies, along with 20 piano sonatas, three piano concerti, and six string quartets. Okay, his third period is what they refer to as the heroic period. I guess you'd say his mature works. These are symphonies 3 through 8. Okay, this period also contains his only opera. Opera was huge, and Beethoven wanted to get in on it, but he found it exceedingly difficult. And so he only ever managed to write one opera. It's funny how some people seem to have a feel for opera and others just don't. You know, that drama. He didn't really get it. Okay, but he did write one opera that is still performed today. Okay, and so that's called Fidelio, by the way. It's one of these rescue operas that comes out of the French Revolution. Here we go again, about people who are locked into prison and are rescued. Okay, political prisoners, basically. Okay, and then his last period, called the late period, is where he is totally deaf. I mean, and he writes a bunch of stuff. His Symphony Number 9, Missa Solemnis, several piano sonatas and string quartets. So, how does a person write? Now, we were talking about with Mozart. He probably had the equivalent to a photographic memory, except for music, hearing. But with Beethoven, that's not it. What we have here is a case of highly refined skill that is so good that now, even though he's going deaf, he knows what it should sound like. So he's able to write these things even though he can't hear them because he knows how they should sound. Okay. All right. What are some of the rules he breaks? Okay. And this even includes, by the way, starting with the very first symphony. And Beethoven technically studied with Haydn, although it's quite clear, Haydn says very clearly that he didn't teach Beethoven anything. And basically, what Beethoven is doing is networking. Haydn knew everybody and had all kinds of influence over people to get jobs. So that's basically what Beethoven's doing. He's networking and stuff. So yeah, he heard what Haydn said about what you should do, but then he turned around and started breaking the rules. Symphony Number 1, for example, doesn't even begin in tonic, which is an odd thing. Okay, especially how key is so important in the classical period. Symphony Number 2, we talk and 2 through 9. From there on out, he substitutes a scherzo for minuet. Now, minuet is a moderate 3, like a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. A scherzo is still triple meter, but it's a fast 6/8. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so it's a very different feeling, right? And scherzo, if you translate it literally, means joke. All right. That's a pretty good indication of what's going on here, and I think even reflects Beethoven's attitude towards established forms, if you will. His third symphony, which is called the Heroic Symphony, is considered the first truly romantic symphony. In fact, this is pretty much where I would say the Romantic period begins, 1803. Okay, it's larger, longer, much. We're starting to really head very strongly in the direction of storytelling, which is a big deal in the Romantic period. And so these themes start to sound almost symbolic of people. So at any rate, the Third Symphony, by most historians, is considered the first truly romantic symphony. Okay, larger forces. So now, remember, the standardized orchestra in the Renaissance didn't exist. Then in the Baroque period, or excuse me, yeah, in the Baroque period, 20 players or less, usually around 12. Okay. Then we had the classical period, and it grows to 40, 45 players. But now with Beethoven, this is growing again 50, 60 players. They get larger and larger as we go along. And Symphony number 3 is where this trend really starts. Then let's jump to Symphony number 5. It doesn't end in tonic, which is, again, strange. It introduces segues between movements, which means that you don't stop. Traditionally, in a 4-movement symphony, for example, you would do first movement, pause, turn the page, start again. After the little pause, you do that 3 times for 4 movements, right? Well, Beethoven thought that for dramatic development, we shouldn't stop between. So in the Fifth Symphony, the third and fourth movements, there's no stop. It just goes from one to the other. So you might think, wow, that third movement's really long. Well, yeah, it's because now you're in the fourth movement. How would you know? Meter, tempo, even just the overall mood of it. Okay. This is the first symphony that we have where one theme is heard throughout the entire symphony, all 4 movements. This is a really powerful unifying feature, and it also lends itself towards the storytelling aspect because it's hard not da 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 da. It's hard not to start to hear that as a symbol of a person. Okay, so that's the first time we see it is in Symphony number 5 when he unifies things. Now that theme, da 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 da, it's traditionally called the fate motif because fate was knocking on the door, and Beethoven says, "No, no, I'm going to live life my way. You can't make me do it your way." Whatever. Okay. Well, as it turns out, this actually was originally the theme came from Birdsong. Okay. Now, how did that happen? Well, a journalist came out to interview Beethoven, and Beethoven basically refused to talk to him. So he talked to Beethoven's manservant. And the manservant said, "Oh, don't you know? That theme is fate knocking on the door. Let me in, Beethoven, let me in." And Beethoven said, "No, no, no." Well, very dramatic, and that's probably why we still talk about it. But later on, Beethoven told us that his themes that he heard on a walk, heard birds chirping. Okay. Now, another reason maybe that people thought this was true, that it was fate knocking on the door, is because the symphony has trombones. Now you think, okay, what's the big deal? Well, up to this point, this is the first symphony to use trombones, and trombones had a very specific purpose in the opera pit. In the opera, trombones were used to denote supernatural events, beings, or happenings. Okay, so they hear trombones in this symphony. Da, 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 da. How could they not think, "Oh my goodness, supernatural! It must be fate." Like they said, it's fate knocking on the door. Well, all these things come together, and of course, we think of it as the fate motif, which I think is perfectly appropriate, but that's not where it came from originally. Okay. The next symphony that we'll talk about is the Sixth Symphony. Talk about breaking rules here, guys. First of all, it has 5 movements, not 4, like the traditional classical symphony. It is a symphony written to tell a story. This is the first truly programmatic symphony. What does it tell? Well, the story's not deep. An afternoon spent in the countryside. First, and instead of tempo markings to mark the movements, like allegro, they have descriptions. Joyful sounds upon arrival in the countryside, and they're dancing and whatnot. By a brook, is there some water running music in there? You think? Yeah. So we're talking also about descriptive music in terms of this storytelling aspect, right? Um, and the fourth movement uses first time someone uses a symphony or an orchestra rather to literally describe a storm. Wow. Okay. And believe me, guys, it was impactful. I could probably think of a dozen composers right off the top of my head that use Beethoven's Storm as a template for writing storm music of their own. And it's even still used today, guys. And some of you might have heard that in Fantasia. Okay. So yeah, we've got these five movements. It tells a story. It's a programmatic symphony. Oh boy, there's just a break with tradition. Whew. All right, let's jump all the way to the Ninth Symphony. Well, what does he do? He introduces a large chorus for the first time ever with a symphony. Okay, big old percussion section. Of course, the forces are getting bigger and everything else. What else happens? The sonata was traditionally slow, fast, slow. Yeah, but he changes it to fast, slow, fast. Okay, just because it's what he had to say. I'm sorry, I got to reverse. Traditionally, it's fast, slow, fast, and he changes it to slow, medium, and fast. Okay, uh, I'm reading wrong notes. Apologize. And so this shows you how he's trying to break out of the restrictions provided by the classical period. They were really restrained. Okay, and so he's breaking out of that, and this is a very romantic attitude. Okay, so um, of his nine symphonies, and they're all good symphonies, guys. They're all still done, but probably the four that really stand out as being innovative and changing things are those four. Symphony number three, the Heroic Symphony, which, by the way, was originally dedicated to Napoleon. Now you think, why Napoleon? Well, now when Napoleon, okay, guys, there was this whole theory that Napoleon was the philosopher king that was going to rise up from the common people and become our philosopher king, and he did. He rose up. He did a lot of good things. They still talk about Napoleonic law and stuff, and so they thought, hey, this is it. But then he took his crowned himself basically emperor of the universe, and everybody went, what happened to the Enlightenment part of this? He's not an enlightened dictator anymore. He's just a dictator. Well, okay, absolute power and all that kind of stuff. So he scratched out the dedication to Napoleon, and instead he wrote "Dedicated to the memory of a great man." What Napoleon was supposed to be—a hero for the people, to a philosopher king, to save everybody. In essence, okay, didn't quite work out. And Beethoven wasn't the only one that was disillusioned by this. People all across Europe were just aghast when Napoleon did this. The other ones that are probably most impactful, Symphony Number Five, yeah, probably the most played symphony ever written, and the Fate motif, da 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 da, right? Again, these segues. There's no pauses between the third, fourth, and fifth movements because of dramatic narrative, right? And this one literally is telling a story. Excuse me. I'm sorry. This is Symphony Number Five. Third and fourth movements are segued together. It's Symphony Number Six that I'm getting all excited about. Okay. Um, to give you another idea how Beethoven changed things up, though, if you go to the first movement, and it's basically in sonata allegro form. Okay, so you have the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. Remember, recapitulation, the original theme comes back in its original form. Okay, in the recapitulation in Symphony Number Five, it starts out this way, and then all of a sudden the orchestra drops out, and we have this oboe solo that we've never heard before. It's kind of random. Okay, and this really confused people. It sounds like the oboe player picked up the wrong music, and the rest of the orchestra just quit. What in the world? But then eventually the orchestra comes back in like nothing happened, and away they go, like it was just an episode. But this was really bizarre. But he did not. That's a good example of not sticking strictly to classical forms, and he was just a place to start. Okay, now let me get to Symphony Number Six that I was getting all excited about. Third, fourth, and fifth movements are all connected with segues. So if you start the third movement, you might think, well, that's a really long third movement. Well, that's because it's the fifth movement. Okay, because there's no stopping between the third, fourth, and fifth movements. Okay, it is programmatic. It tells a story. It's five movements instead of four. Yeah, there's just so many things about this that are just different and leading to blazing a trail to new lands. Okay, and then of course the Ninth Symphony, which is referred to as the choral symphony. All the huge forces brought in, the percussion, the choirs, all of this, an extra orchestra too, by the way, and it's longer too. I mean, depends on who's conducting. But you could, for sure, probably 65, 70 minutes, but probably it could be an hour and a half, depending on who's conducting it. So anyway, and by the way, these forms that we talked about in the classical period, This is basically the fourth movement of the choral symphony. Basically, is a very large rondo. Now, yeah, it's in rondo form, but does that make it classical? No, but it was a starting place, and it's not a strict rondo because in a strict rondo, like in the classical period, A returns exactly like I heard before. Whereas now it doesn't return exactly the same, but it is enough for us to recognize the theme. Okay, and that's going to be, well, thematic for the whole Romantic period, where themes return, but they're not exactly like they were, but it's just enough to remind us of where we came from. Okay. All right. Well, that's Beethoven, guys. And if you want to be a chicken, you can say he's a transitional composer from the classical to the Romantic period. But, guys, the truth of the matter is, he is quite simply the first Romantic composer. Okay. And it took a lot of courage, but he had it. All right, guys. Next up is the Romantic period.